I'm Ann Balsamo, co-facilitator of the FemTechNet learning experiment called DOC 2013. And the title of this experiment is Dialogues on Feminism and Technology. I want to welcome you today to a special dialogue session on the topic of feminism, technology, and race. Our guests today are Maria Fernandez, who is an associate professor in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture at Cornell University. And Lisa Nakamura is now at the University of Michigan, and it's so new that I don't even have your title and your position there.
Oh, Professor of American Cultures and Screen Arts and Cultures.
Okay. So I've asked them to think about 4 very simple questions. So I'm going to start with the first question. How does the topic of race intersect the topics of feminism and technology?
Well, race and gender have been central to the development of feminism. They have been both very productive ideas, very productive concepts, and also very divisive. At the moment, I think various theories, including Wendy Chun, Jennifer Gonzalez, Beth Coleman, and others conceive of race as a technology. And I would also say that gender can be considered as a technology. By technology, they mean a series of techniques that have been historically used to establish differences among people. And so given the centrality of race and gender to feminism, then technology is, and also one thing I forgot to mention is that feminists have been always involved with technologies ever since, at least, all the time, but particularly, I want to stress since the 1960s. So technology, race, and feminism are intimately connected.
Yeah, what I want to say about technology is that not only is race a technology for getting things done, which is getting some people treated differently and seen differently from others, and it's very good at that, and likewise with gender, but I think in contemporary times we now conflate technology with computing particularly. So if someone can't start their car, they don't say, oh, I'm having so much trouble with technology today. Right, or if the birth control pill failed, they say, oh, technology has really failed me now, right? They really think about it in terms of my PowerPoint won't work, my phone just crashed, or I can't find my paper. So technology is really narrowed in recent times, I think, to really mean computing, and that's become a field which also de facto excludes women of color, but women generally and men generally. So when discourses of technology are about geeks and hackers and men who can make, and then women who don't know how to use or are in fact the usability problem. Right? I think there's a lot of emphasis in the industry on user experience, and the implication is that the user is the dumb one. The designer has to design around the stupid user. Well, all technologies are for someone, which means they are not for someone else. So I think science technology studies has been very good at seeing how there's always implicit gendered and race designed. Some things are just easier to use for populations for whom they are meant. And so we've talked about, I think in other writing, the English-only internet, right? When the internet in the 90s was seen as the global village and we would all be on there and be together and exchange ideas on an equal basis, yet 90% of the writing was in English and Google Translate did not exist. So there's always been the internet as a technology of keeping people out. I mean, literally, Mark Zuckerberg's .edu only has always been a way to keep people of lower class, but kind of implicitly as well, people of color, people from identities that don't fit into the elite identity. So I'm glad we're having this conversation because when we mean technology, I think what we really mean now is computing, and there are very few women of color in computing.
I think I think that the theories, for example, Wendy's last book, is really important in actually trying to get away from that notion of just thinking about, computing as technologies. So it's a concept that needs to be rethought along with the others, to which we will get later.
Do you want to talk about the cyber feminist piece, race and labor, or embodiment?
The work, yes. Anne had asked me to talk about the work that I did in the past. And these are articles that I think were generated in the 1990s, in the late 1990s. At the time, I wrote these essays on race and cyberfeminism and technology because there was absolutely no discussion of difference in cyberfeminism, at least in its German variety. And in retrospect, I think that part of the problem was that cyberfeminists were actually basing their discussions in different bodies of theory. So in Germany, it was really important, I think, at the time to engage with the new digital technologies and the rhetoric of disembodiment, the rhetoric that you could be anybody on the internet, that you could change identities based on on a sort of marriage, I think, of Sherry Turkle and Judith Butler. And so I thought that it was really necessary to propose the study of postcolonial studies to begin conversations about difference, the inheritance of colonialism, etc. So in the piece that Anne mentioned at first, is Cyberfeminism Colorblind, I proposed that cyberfeminists should be acquainted at least elementarily with postcolonial theory. Of course, in the United States at that time, postcolonial theory was relatively new, and it was very welcome in fields like art history because it allowed us to discuss things that were in between that before we weren't able to consider, because art history has always depended, or at least had until then, depended on a sort of unspoken concept of purity, where there were pure styles and you couldn't talk about anything in between. So that was the first piece. The second one emerged out of the discussions in cyberfeminism. I was collaborating with Faith Wilding and Sub Rosa at the time. And whenever anybody in Sub Rosa introduced discussions of race or difference or even cultural differences, there was incomprehension and derision, and then this resulted in a lot of friction. And so in the second piece, I wanted to get away from the notion that racism is something people think or intend. And I decided to focus on how racism was manifested in behavior. And so I got interested in habit, and it's, to me, really interesting that this whole conference focuses on habit, because I think, at least at the time I wrote the article, there was very little understanding of racism and any connection of it to the habitual. And so I'm very pleased to see that people are thinking about habit really seriously now. And so those were the pieces that I think you wanted me to.
Yeah, no, this is wonderful. And so the connection, I think, from the concept of race is habit, and then you were also complicating the notion of race as not a concept of an essentialist body based. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how you were also kind of troubling and destabilizing our knee-jerk or concepts of race?
Sure. Well, I was teaching courses in post-colonialism back when it was called world literature. So the notion that not all parts of the world produce literature that came out of the same concerns or the same constraints was really new. And so the internet seemed just like world literature, right? A happy utopian village where everybody's the same, just some people do it a little different. But in my experiences in chat rooms and Muds and Moos in the 90s, I found that was not true. I mean, if you didn't have if you had a name that was gendered neutral, you were always assumed to be a man, and you were always assumed to be white. And if you gave technology advice, which I did often to people with their computers, you were assumed to be a white man automatically. So in my essay, Racing for Cyberspace, Racial Passing on the Internet, which came out in '95, I talk about this as default whiteness. I found myself mistaken for a white man often, which was uncanny, because that has never happened anywhere else. And it's not really happening as much now, because the internet's gone to a real names internet, but it was at one time almost all anonymous. Even listservs, which for young people, it's kind of like, the Model T car. We would email an address, and it would send the email to everyone, but there was no way to look back at the old stuff, and it was really all text, and there was no pictures, and there was no links, or very few, which is how Maria and I met on Undercurrents, which was a very formative listserv. Muds and Moos were the same. There was no pictures, there was anonymous participation, and so I saw not only default whiteness, but a lot of what I called identity tourism, which is both people of color and women passing as men to protect themselves from harassment and to experience for the first time, in many ways, the thrill of being normative, right? Not having any part of your identity commented upon, but rather getting to talk just like everyone else, with some of the attendant difficulties, but also seeing plenty of white men, and most people on the internet in the 90s were men, and most of them were white, masquerading as women of color, as sexy geishas or as hot Latinas, going into chat rooms and saying, I'm wearing a kimono and no underwear. Literally, I saw this. But having had no training in how to interview people particularly, or how to interview people there, which was a brand new thing, and I think people are still working it out. I tried to interpret it through the lens of literature, saying, what does literature have to say about cross-racial passing in this way? Minstrelsy, it's obviously that. It's cultural mimicry. It's appropriation of a temporary sexy identity for the pleasure of the person who does it. And it seemed that so many dynamics around recreational identity and performance were being worked out by people who had never read Butler and didn't care about any of these ideas. They just wanted to have a good time, maybe have cyber sex with somebody. So it seemed like a kind of interesting laboratory for what people could do with identity if they had a few simple tools, like the ability to write their own description or to make up their own name. And so I see this now in console gaming, where people play under assumed names, make up identities, talk to each other sometimes, type to each other. And it's so reminiscent of the 90s with exactly the same problems, right? Some of the exact same problems. But the internet as a whole has become so domesticated. Not to say there isn't terrible racism and sexism, but it's now become, as we were talking about earlier, extremely commercial. And commercial interests don't really like overt racism, they like subtle racism. So you don't see such egregious forms of terrible hate speech and stuff. But so I guess we can talk about where we think research ought to go, given that's the change and such. But anyways.
Yeah, I would like to, in the trajectories from the 90s till now, you're just moving to a new position and you're doing new work. How did the threads of the earlier work kind of inform and pull into the things that you're doing now?
Well, I think that I've been working with a couple of things that are related, although not directly on race. One of them was actually in 2008 for the 40th anniversary of Cybernetic Serendipity, the exhibition that happened in London in 1968. There was a lot of discussion about the merits of that exhibition. Was it good? Was it bad? For those of you who don't know, this was the first and not the first, but the largest exhibition of cybernetic art at the time. And it was the most complex exhibition technically that had been mounted. And so I wondered what the curator, who was a young woman, only 22 years old at the time, her name is Sasha Reichardt, and she was also an immigrant to England from Poland. So although that project wasn't really related to race, it was related to technology and to the role of women in it. The other part of my current work that touches tangentially is an interest I have in Latin American Modernisms and Technology, and at the moment I'm editing a collection of essays on Latin American modernisms and technology. The way that relates is because obeying racial logics, until recently it was believed that Latin Americans could not possibly be interested in technology because they were, they lived in hot climates, which is of course not true. All across, but they also were less industrious than their northern counterparts, so they had no interest in technology. But the research of a number of scholars shows that this is actually not the case, that Latin American artists have been actively involved with technology since at least the 19th century. And recently there was an exhibition and conference in Mexico City that traces those connections to the 17th century. Or earlier, since colonialism began. So that's one way, I guess, that I continue to think about this work. Oh, and there is a book that is coming out next year on Mexican cosmopolitanism in visual culture, which is not about technology, but has some parts on race, some parts on technology, little feminism, however.
Little feminism, that's interesting.
Yes, because it's basically a revision of previous work.
Interesting. Do you want to take that question about how the logics continue in your current work?
Yeah, well, I'm studying console gaming and racism and sexism and how women are creating their own blogs and Tumblrs and kind of aggregations of some of the worst examples and showing them off so as to document just how bad the environment is and how hostile it is and how people use the N-word freely and call each other, call women bitch all the time. And there's just incredibly resurgent racism in it. So I'm thinking of a website called Fat, Ugly, or Slutty, or Why Was I Banned, or Not in the Kitchen Anymore, or Not Your Mama's Gamer. There are so many. I mean, women are really making these kind of crowdsourced, very much about applied feminism, right? The word feminism is almost never used in some cases. It's just like, look what someone said to me after I kicked his ass in Halo, right? He called me this. And they're just old-fashioned racism. But I want to go back to what Maria was saying about hot climates, because if any of us have a computer or anything that makes a call, it probably came from a hot place, Malaysia, southern China, right? Malaysia's the hottest place I've ever been. As Donna Haraway says, women of color are technology. They've been making technology in Silicon Valley, in Asia. They are globalization, right? That is exactly what the rise of China is about, is the hands of many, many Chinese women working overtime to make iPads and Xboxes and other things in time for Christmas launches so that people can line up to buy them. So I recently made my students play the phone game, which is a Molindustria game, I believe. It's an experimental art game studio where they have to play a game by shooting coltan miners and catching workers as they fall out of the Foxconn factory as they're committing suicide trying to make too many iPhones. And my student, male student, not that it matters, said, "Is this just supposed to make me feel bad? Because I need a smartphone for school." And I said, "No, it's not supposed to make you feel bad for yourself." But
you might feel bad for some of the people that
exactly. And so I think Haraway was really the first to bring race and gender together to say that, well, we're going on about disembodiment and even the military-industrial complex. Who is making these machines? Who's emptying the garbage can? Who's cooking the food and taking care of the kids of the inventor, of the developer, of the programmer? Women of color. And so she was able to see that that was a formation of radical social stratification that the internet has actually made much worse. So, social and class inequality is incredibly widened in the last 20 years, which are the years of the web. I mean, the web is now 20 years old, and I don't think that those things are not related. So, there's an incredible aggravation of inequality that is entirely taken for granted now. And it makes me sad that my students believe they just have to work harder so that they can be in the top 1%, right? So I think feminism can really bring back this notion of a collectivity where we don't have to we can't all be in the top 1%, first of all, but there's another model for how to live. And I think women of color feminism, as we were saying, has been modeling that for a long time. And it's certainly a good moment to bring it back.
How about questions? I want to ask you both to help us think about what are the key issues on the agenda, on the horizon, that we should be paying attention to, or that you get a sense of kind of some impending kind of, I don't want to say doom, but impending situations that we should be tracking now in their moments of emergence.
Well, I think that there are a number, and Lisa and I were talking about various aspects earlier, and I think I'll address what I began with, which is gender, feminism, and technology. And since you mentioned Dana Haraway, this is a good segue. This is, I think, a really important moment to rethink feminism. And when one thinks about the propositions that Dana Haraway made in the Manifesto for Cyborgs, a lot of them have become better understood and popularized. So for example, the notion that we cannot differentiate between humans and machines or humans and animals is now pretty well accepted in academia. And I think that there is a lot of writing at the moment that celebrates the commonality of humans with machines, with things, with animals. I want to say that it's really great that we celebrate those commonalities, but at the same time, I think it's really important to keep in mind the specific challenges that face specific groups. I think that race and gender will cease to matter when people stop making differences and hierarchies based on race and gender. And so in order to address these questions, I think we need to become competent, or at least become mildly adept, or begin to think about how to manage these technologies of difference, gender, and race. And I actually begin where I left off, which is basically that we have to be really attentive to our behavior, to the behavior of others, and that if we want to become adept at these technologies, we have to take each of those challenges, race and gender, as a skill that is acquired. And every skill requires focus, it requires repetition, and it requires persistence. So that's what I think for the future. And Lisa?
I've been teaching race studies, post-colonial studies for almost 20 years, and I found that students have a way harder time talking about racism today than they did 20 years ago. They feel very uncomfortable, especially my white male students see it as an odious, odious job. I mean, I've seen so much eye rolling, and they really are over it. And but part of it is anxiety and fear of being caught, right? Of saying something wrong, of not feeling there is a safe space for them. And safe space is a cliche from 70s feminism, but I think it applies when you're talking about online pedagogy. That in some ways, having an online space for discussion is safer for lots of reasons. And part of what feminist pedagogy can do is not only leverage the ways that we can make discussion lists, say, private. We don't have to publicize those. But I found that my students have a much easier time writing about race than they do talking about it, because they can do so at their leisure and not face-to-face with someone who they're afraid they might offend. So we're at a precarious moment in American higher education, I think, where the general education requirement for race ethnicity studies is getting folded into things like globalization studies or area studies or even disability studies, which is fabulous, but it just means that now the ability to talk about race is getting more and more constrained. However, technology is a way in for students. Technology it automatically endows any subject with cachet and relevance, even if it is utterly frivolous and weird. So if you're talking about Pinterest and you throw some vocabulary in there about crowdsourcing and collective intelligence, all of a sudden you're doing scholarship. But if you're just talking about Pinterest, you're kind of wasting your time, right? And I mean, that's a good example of a feminist space, which never gets talked about as a feminist space, right? It only is seen as a time-wasting space for girls who want babies and don't have them, or want big houses and don't have them. So I think that's what feminist pedagogy can do, is to meet people who are 18 to 22 where they are, which is online, but also to use the tools we have to create a space to articulate what's uncomfortable. And I've seen my male students particularly talk freely about race and gender online when they know that it's a private space and only our class is reading it in ways they never could do in person. I tried doing a listserv as support for my class in 1999. It just did not work. It just wasn't good. No one could keep track of who wrote what, and they hated the fact it clogged their inbox. But now we have such better tools like FemTechNet that you can actually have persistent conversations, and they can, grow, and you can kind of get to know people a little better. So as education gets super expensive, you can still have community, and it can be really high quality in a way that wasn't so possible before. So.
May I interject?
Absolutely.
Lisa has been teaching these wonderful courses on video games, and one of the things that we were discussing as future spaces for feminist intervention in the future was precisely video games, and you were telling me about a really interesting example that perhaps...
Oh yeah, just this month I'm a programmer. It's in Slate Magazine, and Slate Magazine covers kind of popular culture stuff, but also some technology stuff. And they called this guy the ideal feminist gamer dad. You heard of him? Yeah, do you want to tell the story of it?
It's the guy who hacked Donkey Kong
Yeah.
for his daughter, right?
Yeah.
His daughter wanted to play Donkey Kong as the princess and rescue Mario, and so he basically rewrote the code and redid all the art so that she could play as a girl. And even it was on Slow Robot today, Guy
Yeah.
of the Year.
Yeah. Yeah, it was everywhere. And the great thing about it is the word feminist was part of the Slate headline. And so feminism can come, it's not always stigmatized, it's not always shunted off to the side. But it was interesting that it was applied to a man in this case, right? Trying to address...
Girl Scout troop leader for 11 years.
Yeah.
Changed tires with us and all
Yeah.
that other drugs.
So this is...
Dungeons and Dragons, I was the only girl I knew who played D&D.
That's cool, but you wouldn't be now, I don't think, right? I mean, the biggest group of online gamers is like women 35 to 45. So it's not what it was, it's diversifying. But Maria is also teaching a wonderful course on video games and race.
Well, it's actually just an investigation of video games. I have been trying to develop this area at Cornell for 10 years, but it was really hard. So I have a couple of PhD students. One of them is Soraya Murray, that you may have encountered in the internet, and the other one is Claudia Pedersen, and they both have written on video games. But for me, actually, the challenge is to become an adept player. and so we're doing a sort of hybrid, research group in which the students are attending to their own research interests, and I have my own goals, but it's just at the beginning. So.
I want to ask one question that knits this historical engagement, feminism, race, technology. How do we develop the habits of undermining and foregoing our own privilege, whether it's privileged by a racial identity, an ethnic and intersectional position? How does the habit of not aspiring to be the 1%, how does that happen?
Well, it was a similar question that the people from Race Trader posed in the 90s, right? I think it has to begin with attentiveness, with the commitment to forming meaningful connections. And I think that in the discussions that have occurred in this conference, there was a questioning of what does connection mean. And so, again, I still think that goal, that change requires a lot of attentiveness on each person's part and commitment to change, which, of course, habits are not that easy to break. And that was actually my question to Tiziana this morning. How do you stop the flow? Because she was talking about habit of something that is passive and active, and she answered in a somewhat abstract way because I think it's a really difficult question that we all need to think about. So that's a main question for the future, I would say.
Yeah, I think the question of how to unthink something you don't know you're thinking, which is what habit is and what racism is, requires a level of pedagogical work, which is hard to put in given the kind of speed up that the students have, I think, that, you know, they're very results driven. And so the idea of being reflective and actually questioning privilege means we're, you know, kind of digging deep to see what you have and acknowledging what it is and what other people don't have, which is not what colleges are optimized to help people do, but which I think is a really strong ethical mission of the college. I mean, what other reason is there for it? You can't say, no one can argue anymore that, you know, the canon is useful to know, if that was ever the case. But when I think about how we can do that, I mean, I think about how the internet is ceaselessly churning out stuff, right? It's this massive collection. It gets bigger all the time. The problem is not content, it's filter, right? Being able to look through it in any kind of meaningful way. And so I think that, you know, women who archive things on their Tumblrs, or feminist work that gathers things together and makes them usable or searchable or coherent by putting them in one place is in fact very profound, right? Because it's a way of filtering for other people and providing a lens. So when we talk about providing a lens, we often mean Baudrillard or Foucault. And that's not what the lens needs to be. Like there's other ways that people can, you know, use their productivity and their eye and their, you know, aesthetic sense to make something that's very feminist. I mean, I think about this bridge called My Back all the time, because it was a really, really important text for me. It made me want to be an academic, made me feel like as a woman of color I could be an academic, because before it did not seem possible. And I read it and it's such a romantic book. It's about the necessity of aesthetic expression and joy, right? Not as an option, and not as something to do after work, and not as something you get to do if you're rich, but something everyone must do to survive, and particularly women of color. And I read this and I still feel the internet is in some ways exactly for that. And so how we can realize that potential is still not open. I mean, it's 20 years since the web, but I think that we're closer than when we had our listservs. I mean, we still don't have our undercurrents conversations. We were talking about that, Faith, that they're gone.
But I think that the point that you bring about aesthetics is really important, because one thing I've been thinking is that we need to reconsider the feminist artwork from the 70s. You know, I think that particularly when it comes to race, understandings of race and the body, those artists already understood the body as technology. They understood the intractability of race. They understood the objectification of the body and the impermanence of the body and the changeability of the body, the malleability of the body. So I think that it's really necessary to do some revisionist work. And you know, when you think about aesthetics and actions, I was thinking of Adrian Piper and racism. The kinds of performances that she did require enormous courage. I mean, if you've ever tried to call somebody on a racist act, particularly somebody you like, then you can understand how difficult those performances must have been. And I think that to sort of educate our students in the literature of feminists of colors from the 80s is really important. And there are a lot of them. I actually made a big list. This is the folder I had under the table in case it came up. But I think it's, you know, for professors particularly, it's really important to educate our students in that literature.
And that's something I love about your work, Maria, is that people see the digital as being a definitive break from what came before. Like there was the internet, and then there was everything else, which was old and had no connection. But I think, as you say, feminist art around race and around identity certainly informed what the internet is now in many ways. I mean, either against it or through it. But, you know, multimedia was once media, as we were saying.
Yes.
And this is the avant-garde. This is experimental media that was kind of paving the way for media to come.
Okay, we need to stop because we have another session. So thank you.